Hi, I'm Rebecca Murphy, and this is Engineering Unblocked. Engineering Unblocked is brought to you by Swarmia, where we're rethinking developer productivity. On today's show, I have the co-founder and CTO of Stytch, Julianna Lamb, and I'm really excited to talk to her about culture and maintaining culture as you're growing your organization, and also some of the interesting aspects of growing your organization in the age of AI. So, Julianna, welcome. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So first, I'll let you do the elevator pitch for Stytch because you're going to be better than I am. But yeah, tell me a little bit about Stytch and kind of how you ended up there.
Awesome. Yeah. So Stytch is a platform for user authentication and fraud detection and prevention. You need to build login into your application. You need to protect your application against bot attacks, abuse, etc. Stytch sort of has a pretty comprehensive platform of just about any sort of like auth method you might want, things like role-based access controls, and then the fraud detection as well. And my background that sort of led to this was primarily coming from experience working at Plaid. It's where my co-founder and I met. And I worked on a bunch of problems related to fraud and authentication there, built a bunch of stuff in-house. The main thing I worked on was building a fraud engine to protect against things like credential stuffing, account takeover attacks. And so we spent just a ton of time sort of like building all of these experiences in-house because we kind of didn't find any vendors that fit our needs. I spent a little bit of time then at another company, VGS, where I worked on many things, but one of them was ripping out Auth0. And so I was catching up with Reed, my co-founder. He was still at Plaid. He was the PM for this team that sort of owned the auth experiences, and basically just like catching up, complaining about work. And that happened to be authentication for both of us. And we were just like, this is crazy. Like, it's one thing to see this at one company, but now we're seeing it again. I wonder if like we're just missing something here and like everyone else has this figured out, or like, is this a really, really common pain point? And so then we spent a bunch of time kind of going and talking to people, and everyone was very enthusiastic to complain about authentication and how frustrating it was and how much time they were pouring into it. Right. And so we ended up starting the company about 5 years ago now, basically, to try and build something better and remove that headache from people's lives.
Yeah, Stytch is one of so many things that, so many off-the-shelf solutions that I wish I had in like 2006, right? Like, it would have been a very different world back then. But yeah, I love to see the emergence of these sorts of things. Like, you don't have to figure this out for yourself, and just like really getting people focused on the actual, like the business problem they're trying to solve, which is not auth. I'm sorry, that's your business problem, but at least you get really good at it. Yeah. So tell me a little bit about the studies. 5 years ago, you started this. Where are you today? How many specifically software engineers do you have working there? And kind of, I want to over time talk about how that growth happened, but let's just start with kind of how big you are, how you're structured, those sorts of things.
Yeah. So the total company is about 65 people, and about 30 of those are on the engineering team. You get something closer to like 40, including sort of like all of end product design. So definitely very sort of like heavily weighted on sort of the EPD org. On our engineering team, we have a couple sort of main teams. We have our sort of like platform team that encompasses things like infrastructure. We have like what we call a core backend team, data engineering, et cetera. And then you sort of have the product focused teams on top of that. We have one team that focuses primarily on kind of like the core auth product, and a sort of like sister team that focuses on our front end SDKs. It's a little bit more sort of specialized. And then we have our web team, which sort of oversees like the developer dashboard, marketing site, docs, and focuses a lot on kind of like growth and activation for our customers. And then the last team that we have is what we call our sort of like R&D labs team. So they own the fraud detection product today and are always sort of continuously working on sort of incubating new ideas. That fraud product sort of came through an incubation about 3 years ago now, and is now sort of like a fully launched live product. And so kind of balancing sort of continuing to invest in things that are working, but also finding that time for sort of more focused like R&D work, particularly when it comes to like security and how we can basically solve more problems for our customers, help them better sort of protect their applications.
I imagine that fraud is a endless hole to dig. And when I was at Stripe, like, yes, fraud. Anyway, so obviously you didn't start out like that. I'm guessing it was just the two of you, or maybe the three of you, or something like that. But how has the organization grown, and how have you kind of thought as the CTO? How have you thought about growth and when to grow and how to grow that engineering team?
Yeah, so initially it was just me and my co-founder. We ended up raising a seed round like pretty quickly. And so hired sort of 4 engineers basically right out of the gate. And so it went from like, just sort of the two of us like prototyping things to sort of going heads down and building sort of the V1 product. I think building in the infrastructure space, like there's a lot that you need to sort of lay foundationally to be able to like build and scale a product. People don't want bugs in their authentication vendor or reliability issues. And so we were fortunate that we were able to kind of like be intentional. And the way we've kind of talked about it is like we went pretty slow in like the first maybe sort of like 6 to 9 months of the company to lay that foundation and then be able to like really quickly sort of build on top of that without having to like stress as much about kind of like scaling challenges for hopefully like at least a solid period of time. And so we ended up then sort of maybe a year into the company starting to really grow out the team. We'd hired a few more engineers at this point. And that's when we sort of introduced engineering managers for the first time. So we started with just sort of 2 very functional. One was one of our founding engineers. So she was sort of owning everything like front end. And then we had one other engineering manager that we hired in that did all of the sort of like back end and platform pieces. And so we stayed pretty functional, I think, for another like year or so. I think that worked well when the team wasn't too big. I think we were probably up to like 15 engineers with that structure. And then you start to run into, I think, just like a lot of kind of like coordination costs and bottlenecks. And the way that our product works is that the API is like a really big piece of it. But if you don't have the SDK support, you don't have the dashboard support, like you can't really fully launch a feature. And so we're just running into like blockers where 2 teams were having to like coordinate on everything. And then the way that like our sort of backend engineers that work on product think about the work that they're doing is very different than our backend engineers that work on like foundational scalability challenges. And so ended up kind of splitting out into something that looks more similar to our current structure. I think there are a few pieces that have like sort of evolved over time, like figuring out how we sort of work with front end SDKs and how that team maps in has been sort of an evolution. And then this sort of like labs team that's focused on fraud detection. We basically hired in one person that we'd worked with before who does a lot of just like security R&D work. And so we like hired him in knowing that he was going to be doing R&D stuff. And we were like, okay, go off and let's like figure out what we're doing. Yes, exactly. Go explore. And then once we got something that was like really sticking, then we started to sort of like build out that team a little bit more. So it's definitely evolved, but I think we've been in somewhat of a steady sort of like structure for maybe 2 years or so now. The team has grown a bunch, but we haven't quite outgrown that structure yet. I think we're starting to get to that point. Like the sort of core auth products team is about 9 engineers right now. And it's pretty big for one team.
Something's got to happen, probably. Yeah. I want to go back to something you said back at the very beginning, because often, startups are so focused on, and correctly so focused on product market fit, that they're not worrying about those, those operational concerns so much. But like you said, with an auth provider, that's not very optional. So how did that manifest as far as like what you were spending time on early on versus what you deferred until later?
Yeah. So I think there were sort of two main pieces that we wanted to invest in there. One is on sort of like the scalability side, and that is just like getting a good sort of like V1 of our infrastructure that we felt like would scale with us, and investing the time to make sure that we had sort of the right things in place. I think that ended up paying off, where I think we've been able to pretty seamlessly scale for the most part, up until maybe like the past like 2 or so years. And then we started to hit bottlenecks, but still have been able to like largely iterate on kind of like our existing architecture and not have to like totally sort of redo things. I don't think we did anything like, I don't know, super special or like crazy. I think we just used modern infrastructure tooling, things like Kubernetes, making sure that we just had like scalable CI/CD processes, like all of those things we did early on. And I think that was helpful to like lay a good foundation, both in terms of like how our infrastructure scales, but then I think also on like engineering best practices, like having CI/CD and tests from like day one, I think like lets you sort of incrementally invest in that without having to like, have a sort of like, oh my gosh, we have to redo everything and like redo culture and like, let's like spend a bunch of time kind of like resetting how we work. So I think that was valuable. And then the other piece that we invested a lot in early days was sort of a foundational like developer experience. I think we believed that having the right sort of like SDK experience, docs, et cetera, was really critical for this product. Like developer experience is huge, right? And I think there's a lot of sort of value in figuring that out with a small surface area. And so we focused on building basically one auth product. We started with email magic links and really investing in kind of like what are those pieces that we think provides like kind of like the minimum like competitive developer experience, but for this one product. And then we can go and add additional products really easily on top of that. Obviously, like all of that has evolved so much since then, but I do think like that was valuable focus to be hyper specific on like what is the one product that we think can be viable on its own and like people will be able to just like use that standalone and then invest in sort of the experience around that before expanding surface area.
So you mentioned culture, and it sounds like that focus on developer experience. And I want to be, so you said developer experience. When I talk developer experience, my brain is internal developer experience, which maybe we can talk about. But you're talking about the experience of customer developers using your product. So I just wanted to clarify that for the audience. But that kind of focus on that is a cultural choice, right? And it's something that you need to figure out how to perpetuate if you believe it's still a good thing. What are some other? I want to talk about how you perpetuate it through growth, but first, like, what are some other kind of cultural things that you established early on that feel important, and what are some that you kind of accumulated along the way?
Yeah, so I think we are, I would say, a pretty doc-heavy engineering team and culture. And I think a lot of that comes from starting in 2020 when everyone was remote. We're sort of hybrid at this point. Like majority of our team is in office, but I think like 40% is still distributed. And I think it's also probably some of that mentality of like put in the like early work so that the sort of rest takes care of itself. And so I think we spend a lot more time on kind of like upfront, like design of what we're building so that once you get into execution, there shouldn't be like too many sort of unknowns. Obviously, if like there's never an unknown or like decision that you have to work through, you probably spent too much time up front. But kind of like finding what is that right balance of like, let's like work through things in a doc, make sure that like key architecture decisions or any sort of like contentious implementation choices are getting discussed before you're actually sort of putting pen to paper. So I think that has continued to sort of perpetuate. And I don't think it was also like super intentional. I don't know that I would describe like myself, for example, as like a super docs forward person. But I think that was like sort of something that just took foothold early on and served us when we were small and continues to serve us today. And so it sort of perpetuated. I think in terms of other pieces of culture, I do think internal developer experience is something that we have prioritized from sort of early days. And it obviously didn't start like this, but at this point we have like, I think, a pretty robust remote developer sort of environment that everyone has their own, full sort of like replication of our stack. And that we've had since like maybe 2021, so like 4 years now. So we had it very, very early. And I think like continue to put a lot of emphasis on kind of like, where are those friction points in building products? Where are we like uncertain about things and need to have better test coverage? Like focusing a lot on kind of like, how can you move really quickly and safely developing code?
Yeah, I mean, simply the fact that you started with tests and CI/CD, and I'm so amused by so now I'm working for a relatively small company about the size of Stytch, but I worked at Stripe, I worked at Indeed, and I worked at a couple other larger companies, and like the remote development environment is just cracking me up because when the pandemic happened, I was at Indeed, and there had been some like little tinkering on a remote development environment. And suddenly, like, but people were otherwise, they came to work every day and developed on their Unix desktop that was under their desk. And so, like, I saw remote development environments happen there. And then I went to Stripe, and same like 2020, 2021, 2022, they're working on exactly the same thing. So, but it's so interesting to hear, like, as startups form and evolve, you just know to do that from the beginning, and it's so much easier to do from the beginning than like, let's write tests now, is so much harder. But it's just interesting to see kind of how the newer you are, the more you can take advantage of all the things that we've learned before.
yeah and writing your like first test when you have one product is very easy. Going back and like, if we had to test everything today, oh my gosh, that would take so much time.
Yeah. How do you think about quality, basically, and ensuring it? Yes, automated tests go a long way, but they don't cover all cases in most cases.
Yeah, so what we do today is like pretty comprehensive sort of unit tests, and then we have a bunch of synthetic tests that basically run and will block deploys. We have talked about doing blue-green deployments for a while, and I think that's been one that the trade-offs in terms of like internal developer velocity versus the gains are not quite there yet. I think we'll do it at some point, probably soon-ish, but we found that sort of like, I think the testing culture too of just like emphasizing that. I think there's like, maybe it's hard to quantify to some degree. Like I do think people are very sort of like intentional with their changes and emphasize sort of good sort of testing practices, whether that's like, writing tests as they're shipping new features, also doing like manual validation to make sure sort of like the workflow that they're working on is going to fit together in the right ways. And I feel like you could dig in and maybe say, okay, is the time that goes into that actually more significant than the like additional sort of time that would need to go into people sort of thinking about like the blue-green deploy? Maybe, but it's working for us. And so I think we're like, okay, this is fine enough. And another, I think, interesting thing that we do that I think does sort of like emphasize the importance of like thoroughness of testing is we do like continuous deploys. So we use a merge queue, things automatically deploy to staging, and then if that's successful, get deployed to prod. And so I think that mentality of like, hey, when I hit merge, like this is going straight to prod, unless you want to like pause deploys for something that's particularly risky. I think that just creates a culture of like, you need to test it because like you don't have sort of like the opportunity to, catch it at staging and manually test it. And I think that is much more sort of like brittle than doing the work up front. And yeah, when you hit merge, you're like, okay, this is going to prod, it's ready to go.
Yeah, I feel like I've lived through many generations of all of this, and it's a delight to hear that like these things are like not easy, but so much easier and you're seeing so much like you get the benefit of it. You don't need to be convinced that this is work worth doing. And that it is actually essential to your product and not like a nice to have. Do you have any team that is focused on developer experience or on like internal tooling or owning that? I'm imagining if somebody owns that remote development environment project, for example. So what does that look like? And maybe more interestingly, when did that become its own thing, or has it become its own thing yet?
Yeah, so our platform team owns that today. They own many other things though, which I think does like sometimes raise interesting prioritization questions because they're having to weigh sort of like, investments in like infrastructure reliability with the remote dev environment. And I think so far that's working, but I can also see that at some point, it's just really hard to like prioritize those things against each other. And so having a team that's like, yeah, you just own developer productivity makes that a lot easier. I think we're not at the size and scale where we can do that. But largely so our platform team has kind of like sub teams. They operate kind of as one big blob team, but like infrastructure.
I'm familiar.
versus like core backend
right.
is a little different. So mostly infra is sort of owning the remote dev environment. And then the core backend team, like one of their mandates too, is to invest in things that like help improve kind of developer experience for working in sort of like our API code base. So that might look like sort of observability improvements. We have like a sort of standard interface that makes it easy to sort of emit your observability data, logs, traces, et cetera, so that they don't have to think about that, right? Stuff like that, where it just improves kind of like the day-to-day developer experience. So there's like, yeah, a few different pieces of teams thinking about this, but no team that fully owns it. I think it's been that way. It's been that way for a while, probably really since we started having any sense of like a platform team, which I think has been like 4 years now. Okay. So they've kind of always owned it. And originally it was like we had one infrastructure engineer and he owned it, and then there was a second one.
And there were two.
Yeah, sort of always been a piece of what they do.
Got it. So you've also mentioned this culture of speed, and it sounds like you're investing pretty impressively in making sure that developers can move quickly. What have you done to preserve that culture of speed and like forward movement?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think we've done, I would say, okay on this. I think it's like kind of a constant thing that we're trying to find the right balance on, because I do think like I've spent a bunch of time talking about like quality and reliability, right? And like we're building critical infrastructure. It's a security product. Like getting things right is really, really important. And I think like if we indexed too far on one side, I'd rather us index too far on sort of like moving like slowly and carefully. But I do think we're a little too far that way, and like sometimes have to, I think, push a little bit on kind of the like, when does it make sense to like move quickly on something versus when does it make sense to like be more sort of intentional and thorough. And I think building different parts of the product, building different products, like there's pieces that I think you might want to strike one side versus the other. And then I think part of the emphasis on kind of like, what are the things that we can do to make it like easier and safer to move quickly, or around that of like, how can we abstract things away or make it just like a lot harder to like, make a mistake or like not be able to like fully understand the implications of your changes because there's so much spaghetti code everywhere and the interactions are really hard to reason through and whatnot. So I think when I talk about velocity, like it's not just saying, okay, like, write code more quickly, ship it more quickly. It's like, how do we sort of like make that easier for people?
It's an enablement problem. It's not like a finger pointing problem.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think it's like easy to, when you're in sort of the code base day to day, to like, and focus on building new features, to like lose perspective of like, okay, where is there a ton of friction or just like, scary sort of like code that you're having to work through. And so having a separate team that's like a little bit kind of like owning that foundational piece helps, I think, bring that perspective. But then I also think it's like part of my role is to like push people and be like, hey, like you're really good at just like putting your head down and like figuring this out, but like, can we make it easier for you to do that? Can we like help accelerate things? So I think it's like good that there's like some tension there, and I think something you always have to push a bit on.
Yeah, that's so like the Stockholm syndrome of like, of course I have to edit these 20 files. I always edit these 20 files, right? So one thing that I've seen in my experience is I got to go through like a growth from 200 to 1,000 engineers a few years back, and very interesting to see. But even as they were at the beginning of that scaling, they were running kind of headfirst into quality issues. But yeah, how do you feel you've done as far as managing quality through the growth of the engineering team?
Yeah, I think we have, done well on that overall. Obviously, like not perfect, but I think like emphasis on, I think that sort of like quality of the code you're shipping and like ownership of individuals over like the changes that they're putting out there goes a long way. But then having good monitoring and alerting, I think that's another thing that we like really, really early on invested in. Like, yeah, we had PagerDuty set up before we did our like alpha launch and had no customers.
You were ready.
Yeah. And I think some of it is like just doing that, right? So like we've always had an on-call rotation because we just like knew that we were critical infrastructure, and like even when we had, a couple of customers, like a major outage could really quickly erode trust. And so I think like having that from so early on just makes it sort of like a critical piece of the culture. And so as you're onboarding new people, like they just see the emphasis on kind of like operational excellence, and I think sort of rise to the occasion then and like prioritize it as well. So I think that's largely something that we've been pretty effective at. I think we've definitely ran into scaling challenges as we've onboarded bigger and bigger customers. And I think making sure that we're finding the right balance of like investing in sort of foundational work to enable kind of like the next phase of scale without sort of like over engineering and trying to like go through essentially an academic exercise of like what would it look like to have like significantly more scale that we don't know when that's coming. And so I think we've largely balanced that well. There have been a few sort of like fire drills that we've had to run when like we had a really big customer onboarding in like the next month, and we knew that there were a few bottlenecks they were going to run into. But I think we've had a lot of low-hanging fruit in a way that's like made that doable. It's not like we had to totally, re-architect everything. But I do think that balance is really tough to strike, where you want to be like investing in the right sort of foundational stuff, but also like you need to build products, you need to onboard customers. And as a startup, like that's the most important thing. I think like speed of execution and sort of like making sure that we're like able to stay competitive in the market is like table stakes. And you need to have the right sort of like baseline reliability. And I think we go well above and beyond that, but there's like a degree at which you could go above and beyond that's like just not a good use of time. Right.
As you continue to grow, well, first, like, how are you, this is a sticky topic, but like, how are you thinking about culture fit? And how are you thinking, like, how are you thinking about what you need to add and what you need to maintain in your engineering culture as you grow?
Yeah. So I think the way we kind of think about evaluating candidates and seeing who might be a good fit is that we have sort of like our defined technical bar, and everyone needs to clear that technical bar. And if you don't, then there's no conversation, basically. We want people that are going to sort of spike in some areas. So we want them to have things above sort of this baseline that we can get really excited about. That could be like specific experience with a certain technology or domain or something like that. It could be just like really strong kind of like product mindedness about how they sort of like approach the work that they're doing, the problem solving that they're doing. It could be really, really strong like testing fundamentals. Like there's a bunch of different things there, and we're not looking for like specific ones. We're just looking for people to like demonstrate expertise and like sort of excellence in some area. Exactly. And then we talk about sort of values fit. So my co-founder and I do a values interview for every candidate. I do most of the engineering ones. He does most of the go-to-market ones. And we have sort of three main values, although I will say there's definitely like a favorite value that's most important. And I think if you check that, the others sort of come along. And that main one is be an owner. I think the ownership mentality is like what everyone needs to succeed here, because we're a small company. We're like trying to figure a lot out still. And that's really exciting. If like you want to take ownership of the work you're doing, find opportunities to have impact. And I think you can grow really quickly as a result. But if you're the type of person that needs sort of like a really thorough plan handed to you, you're not going to be successful here. Like we don't have time to always have a fully baked plan. And I think like there's just so many things that we need to get done in like a given week or month. And knowing sort of like when to go above and beyond and really take ownership over something because it's going to make a difference for a customer, a teammate, whoever it might be, is super important. We want people that like when there's an opportunity to kind of like step up, they're going to take it and not sort of like run away from it. So I think that's by far the most important. Our other two values are act with urgency and prioritize for impact. We really like those because I think like a lot of the things we've been talking about are like, how do we find that balance of like working on big, important things, but also like moving quickly. And so we want people to kind of be like working through that tension day to day in the work that they're doing and making sure that like they are prioritizing the right sort of like big, impactful projects. But also when there is an opportunity to like act urgently and like solve a customer issue or something like that, it's often worth like a quick distraction in the long run to be able to like solve that problem quickly. And I think we're like looking for people that have that ownership to be able to like be excited about making those decisions and thinking through like the implications of the work they're doing, not just like the how I build this thing that someone has told me to build.
I ask people a lot, like, how do you see AI influencing the role of the junior engineer, right? The role of the new grad. And I'm curious because I have also worked at places where we just hired like experienced, strong people, not so many juniors at all, and just high independence and high execution. And I've been at a place where we hired like seas of new grads and ran them through like a 3-month orientation program and all this stuff. So how are you thinking about that sort of like leveling mix in your engineering organization?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think we've skewed a lot more senior just because of sort of like the size of our team. And I think the hybrid nature, I think we've found it harder to have like significant number of sort of junior engineers on the team and set them up for success. We have some, and we've hired new grads in the past, and some of them have grown a ton with us and have been super successful. And we are hiring on sort of like the early career side right now, but just a couple folks. And I think like we have kind of gone back and forth. I think some of it early days too is like, I think having sort of more junior talent can be really valuable because you just like have a bunch you need to get done, and you need people who are like super excited to just be like thrown off the deep end and like figure it out. But I think you always need that balance of like, you can waste a bunch of time if like there's no one kind of like setting direction. And I think over time we've kind of like skewed a little bit more senior. Some of that is like, there are a lot of people who have like been here for a few years and like started early career with us and have grown and are now senior. But I also think there's just like, we've been in such a sort of like execution mode of like, we just know what we need to build and there's a lot to get done. And we need to like be sort of like really focused on the execution piece, and having people who can just like lead a project and run with it has been really important. But I think like we are hiring, I think mostly actually early career on engineering right now because I think the team is now feeling the pain of like everyone being a project lead, and we need more people that are sort of like opportunities for our current team to mentor. But also I think we just like have the capacity to like help sort of like teach and grow people right now. So I think it's like a tough balance. And I think it's a tough balance when we have grown over the past 5 years, like obviously a lot in total, but it's been 5 years and like pretty steady growth. And so when you're not like hiring a ton of people, I think it's like much easier to be conservative and skew a little bit more senior. And so I think we've definitely taken that route historically, and are now kind of like, okay, yeah, we don't have quite the right composition. We need to rebalance a little bit more.
So you've been hiring all along, and you're continuing to hire now. What is, I confess, when I was last hiring, it was 2022, I guess. So I'm embarrassed. I haven't conducted an interview for a software engineer in 3 years now. What does it look like in 2025?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting time with AI, and I think depending on how companies are thinking about it, like I think we're really seeing sort of like everyone get on the AI train right now in terms of like how teams are working. I do think at this point, like it feels pretty inevitable that AI is going to be a critical piece of software engineering going forward. It's just so powerful. It can remove, I think, so much like grunt work and give you so much more sort of like opportunity to spend time on interesting problems instead of, repetitive sort of mundane tasks. And I think being able to like leverage it well is going to be critical. I think a lot of it comes down to like good sort of like systems thinking and problem solving. I think like the most interesting part of engineering, I don't think has ever really been writing code, but especially now. And so people who are able to problem solve really effectively and sort of have that systems thinking perspective, I think will be able to like leverage it to a really powerful degree. And so I think those skills become even more important to test for in the interview process versus like, can you like, solve this leak code problem and write some like small toy functions that do something. And I think we're at the point where we're like redoing a few of our interviews, basically to make it like less trivial for AI to solve, because we also want to see people in their natural environment when they're interviewing. So we have people share their screen, use their sort of normal coding setup. And we've always done that. I was looking at a doc I wrote in 2021 last week about hiring and like how important it was to like see how people were able to like use the tools at their disposal, Google, Stack Overflow, et cetera. You just replace that with AI, and I think it's exactly the same. But I do think, we had a few interview questions that we just found. If you were using something like Cursor and you started writing it, it would kind of just like solve it for you. Yeah. And I think that just shows that like, I'm not sure those were ever great interview questions in hindsight, because like, I think the problem solving aspect is really important. And I think we're able to get good signal because you had to sort of like struggle through writing the code. But I think now we're like, okay, we need to be a little bit more high level in terms of like the problem solving aspect of these coding interviews. And make sure that we're able to get that signal and then also see how people do use the tools at their disposal. Like, I don't think we are saying you must absolutely use AI in the interview, but if that's how you normally work, we want to see that. And I think we do want to make sure that we're like hiring people that have an appetite for like experimenting, trying new things, and are excited to like leverage AI and the tools at their disposal.
So you mentioned system thinking there, which is something that we don't normally look for until like, you've had 2 promotions or so. So what, like, how is that going to change? How do those expectations change what you're looking for in those new grads or junior roles? Because is system thinking going to be like, is that going to get pushed as an earlier requirement?
Yeah, we actually just redid our interview loop. We used to do 2 like coding interviews for phone screen, and then as part of the onsite, we would do like a systems design question. And we swapped one of those coding interviews with systems design. And it's not meant to be an interview that like you need really specific sort of like expertise in certain technologies if you're early career, right? Like it's more kind of like, how do you think about sort of like structuring data, and how do you think about like building APIs and like putting all the pieces together, and like can you reason through like a complex system essentially? And so I think we are, emphasizing that a lot more clearly. I think we're saying, hey, like, you need to pass this to get to a final round, because it's not like we're just not going to hire people that can't excel on that. And I think a lot of it too is like looking for sort of like the collaboration and problem solving aspect of it. Can you like work with the interviewer, to get to a good sort of design there? And I think those pieces of the job are going to be, super, super critical. And so even if you're early career, we want to see sort of like how you approach that, how you solve that problem. I think it'll be interesting to see if we do end up sort of like hiring, I don't know, like staff plus. We haven't hired sort of that senior in a while. And I feel like it becomes even more critical there. And so we probably want even more systems design questions, but we don't have interview loops for that right now.
I do miss it. Oh my goodness. I never thought I would say that. Back in the days when I had like, 4 a day or something like that.
It's exhausting.
Right? I miss it. So last question before we wrap up. You have this ambition to grow and you have this ambition to preserve culture as you're doing it. What does success look like a year from now? Like, how do you know, like, oh, we did it. We pulled it off.
Yeah, I think something I always talk about it like when we're onboarding new people, and it's how I think about interviews, is that I think each person should bring something new to the team. They should be sort of like a values fit in that they're going to like work well with the existing team. But I want everyone to make us better in some way, bring a different perspective. And so I think like we've come a long ways. Like I think, especially going through kind of like, I don't know, the 20 to 60 phase of growth, like you're growing quickly, things break, and you have to kind of like reset and make sure that you're like building the team with the right expertise, et cetera. And I think like looking back, it's like, yeah, we've like come so far, we've improved so much. And that's because we've hired amazing people that have like helped us figure things out and improve. And so I think if I'm like talking about culture a year from now, I hope I'm talking about slightly different problems or like that we've evolved in some way. I think that's also, I think, just super important for a startup is like if you're solving the same problem month after month, like you're not making progress, but you're always going to have problems to solve. And so you just want them to be changing. So I hope people have pushed us in terms of culture in some ways. And there are pieces of like the sort of like development experience internally that I like have in the back of my head that someone's going to come in and be like, oh my gosh, we can transform this. I know the answer. So I think really looking for kind of like that growth as a team overall.
Well, Julianna, this has been awesome. Thank you for reminding me that interviewing exists and just sharing your journey these last few years. Really interesting to hear all the decisions that you've had to make and all the things that you've had to think about. So this has been awesome. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
And that's the show. Engineering Unblocked is brought to you by Swarmio, where we're rethinking developer productivity. See you next time.